A witch cake has the urine of the afflicted girls baked into the cake. Then the cake is fed to a hog, and then you watch the hog for some more divination. Or the hog's digestive system is supposed to, like, purify them. Hard to say.
It's also the recipe for matzah, by the way.
History, I'd like to follow me down the rabbit hole. History, I'd like to, frankly, I want to know.
Hello, and welcome to HILF, History I'd Like to Fuck with Dawn Brody. I'm Dawn Brody, this witch. I knew someone would choose this in my first season. I knew it, and I'm so glad. Who doesn't want to get tits deep in the history of the Salem Witch Trials? Now, they're not the only witch trials that ever were, of course. Europe really took the gold with history's most torturous and prolific witch hunting. But there was something about what happened in Salem, Massachusetts, that 1 year of accusation, madness, and murder that seems to spellbind us still. Before we jump in, though, some exciting news. We've got merch. Yes, it's here. The koozie you've always wanted. It keeps your beverage cold while letting the world know you're hot for history. So go take a look at them on our Instagram page, @HILF Podcast. And from there, find the link tree to all things HILF. Tickets to live recordings. Our first one is coming up on May 26th in Glendale, California. Rate and review our podcast, would you please? And get yourself the koozie of your dreams. But first, my guest today is comedian and Boston native Alex Malt. We've performed comedy together several times over the years, and he is a delight. He grew up very near the city of Salem, but had a sort of general ambivalence to all the witchy stuff, and admits he knows next to nothing about the history. You know how much Mama loves a virgin. So, pull your chair up a little closer to the cauldron. It's the HILF of the Salem Witch Trials. Let's get started. Alex Malt, you are a stand-up comedian.
I am.
You are my buddy.
I am.
And one of the things that will always keep a place for you in my heart is that after the worst of COVID, people are vaccinated, things were happening outside, I did my first ever back in-person live comedy with you. We did a backyard show in Hollywood. Do you remember that?
Yeah, backyard shows are super fun.
Those are so fun.
Those
I hadn't done one before that. I mean, just those like pop-up, somebody had a sound system and a bunch of folding chairs. There were like, 25 people there?
Yeah, 25, 30, something like that. But just, everyone was ready to laugh at that point.
Oh my God. And it was kind of like a kegger in the garage and stuff.
Yeah.
How long have you been doing comedy?
I've been writing comedy for 12 years now, I think. I've been saying I've been out here a decade for at least 2 years now. So I think that would put me right at about 12 years of that. And then I've been doing stand-up comedy for the last 6 or 7 years.
And you have been doing great. As we were setting up the equipment, you said that you are driving from my house. You were going to the World Series of Comedy in Las Vegas.
Yeah, I'm headed to Vegas. Was just in Arizona, going to be in Sarasota, Florida, Boston. So starting to travel.
I love that,
around,
man.
so
and if
exciting.
I'm not mistaken, I took a look at your website. You're going to fucking Cabo, man?
Yeah, I'm doing Cabo May 6th and 7th.
How did that happen?
Literally the magic of Instagram. I saw one of the comedy clubs is like, we're opening a club in Cabo if any comedians want to do it. And I was like, yeah, I will do Cabo. Thank you. So the comedy's paying my plane ticket down there, and
Fucking
I'll take it.
That's such a good idea. Just like take a world map, stick your pins in where you want to go, and then look up a comedy club there. That's a great...
Suck it, destination wedding, and I'm doing destination comedy shows.
That's right. If somebody wants to get married, that's their fucking business. I'm just there to tell jokes. What brought you to stand-up?
I've always loved stand-up. It's one of those things that's been escaped from me since I was super young. I got my first fake ID in order to sneak into comedy clubs, which is super nice. Always figured one day I would drunkenly get on stage and just be a sensation. And only succeeded in the drunken part of that. But went to rehab, was out on a Thursday in a stand-up class on a Monday.
Hey.
And yeah.
Who was the comedian that first brought you in or that attracted your comedic sensibilities?
Dana, and I could not be farther from him as a comedian, but Dana Carvey. When I was little, I loved Dana Carvey.
Come on, Garth.
Yeah.
Right?
And just, I don't know, when you're little, impressions are the funniest thing in the world.
Oh,
And
yeah.
he's a master of that,
Yeah.
goofy faces and everything.
Yeah.
I just remember he had a bit about his kids doing naked time. And I thought that was the funniest thing in the world. Well, the very first show I did on stage was at West Side Comedy. And who should walk into the green room but Dana Carvey?
No shit.
My first show, I
How did you handle it? How did you handle
Dana Carvey. Oh, I played it cool. I think.
You think? Oh,
Maybe
I'm so
I didn't.
glad. I mean, it's
But-
good that at least you think you did, whether you did or not, because, man, meeting your heroes can be a real harrowing experience. I often, when I talk to a guest about being on the show,
Yeah.
sometimes I have to give them a couple prompts. Well, some possible subjects that maybe you'd be interested in. Sometimes my guests come to me right away like, this is the thing I want to do. You came back really fast with Witch Trials. Can you tell me what it is about this history subject that gets you so
Yeah,
turned?
I think I gave you 3 things. I did Mary Shelley, which was like your first episode,
My first
I guess.
episode, that's right.
And then I did Cabeza de Vaca, which I guess you had just talked about as well. And then, Salem Witch Trials, because I'm from Boston, so I thought that would be good. And then it's one of those things, like, I imagine if you live in Orlando, you don't go to Disney World that often. That, like, everyone's like, oh, Salem, it's half an hour away from you. You must have gone there all the time. And, like, I've been there, I think, but I honestly don't know a ton about it. Because, it's like,
You
it's
didn't
one
take
of
any
those...
school field trips out there? Your English class, your history class, nothing?
We did like the old timey village. I think it was called Sturbridge Village, which was one of those places where everyone pretended that they were like living back in colonial times.
Like reenactors,
And like you just did not appreciate it as a 4th grader,
No.
and your whole goal was to get them to admit that cell phones existed.
And did they
Because
be
they'd
like,
have to pretend that, like, what is this cell phone you speak of?
Oh,
and you're like, oh, come on, dude. You know what a cell phone is. Like,
and they'd be like, we're just here to show you how to turn butter without making you do jerk-off motions. Like, that's a full-time job for a reenactor.
Salem, it's like one of those places that's super close to me, right? But like everyone has a weird relationship to it. So you have people that show up and like they've just heard the like folk tale and they want to talk about like witches with pointy hat, like the full fairy tale version.
Yeah.
And then you have like people with, there's like, I know there's ergot theories and there's other things out there. So it's one of those things where it gets talked at you when you're from Boston enough that you disengage from it. And because no one has the same relationship to it. So I'm excited to learn the facts.
Oh, girl, I think you're gonna go home this year for Thanksgiving, and you're gonna wear the T-shirt. Like, ask me about Salem, and you're gonna be very. This is gonna change, I think, a lot of things for you.
Awesome.
It was a joy, I have to tell you, because I didn't know a lot of the details. I knew some of the broad strokes. I remember researching certain elements of this in like my freshman year of college, and so some of these names came back as a little familiar to me. But I had to start from scratch, and it was a delight. I have 2 books this time.
Awesome.
The first one is called Death in Salem by Diane Foulds. And this book, Alex, was so great because it's just personal profiles of the people involved. So you get a little bit of the timeline, you get a little bit of the history, but it focuses entirely on the individuals. So like 1 or 2 pages focusing on the accusers, the victims, the judges, the clergy, and it's super, super fascinating and was a great companion to the second book I read, which you can see is kind of a tome. It's huge. It's called The Salem Witch Trials, a Day-by-Day Chronicle of a Community Under Siege by Marilynne K Roach. This book, yikes.
It's like Ken Burns documentary in book form.
Girl, yes, it is. It is a day by day. I have full disclosure. I did not read every page of this book because what I did is I would reference this day-by-day chronicle from the first book.
That's
so if
cool.
this one started talking about this victim that I thought was particularly interesting, I could bounce back over to this other book and learn more about her engagement with the individuals on the days in which she was tried.
That's fun.
And it was really
That's cool.
fun. Very cool. Super illuminating. I had a blast. Okay, so the Salem Witch Trials. First of all, Salem, it's about 25, 30 miles north of Boston. And at the time that we're talking about, the late 1600s, is all part of Massachusetts Bay Colony, of course, under the rule of Mother England. And so the year we're talking about, the Salem Witch Trials took place just over 1 year, from 1692 to 1693. So for context, that's 200 years after Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and about 100 years before the signing of the U.S. Constitution.
Okay.
So, like, George Washington's proximity to the Salem Witch Trials was almost identical to my proximity to World War II.
All right.
So it's
Yeah.
you might have known people who were around, but it's already ancient history. The world has changed 10 times.
You were
since
lucky
then.
if they lived that long back
right.
then.
That's right. Here are the statistics. For this 1 year span of time, from 1692 to 1693, within the city of Salem, 200 people were accused of being witches. 30 were found guilty. 20 were executed. Of those 20, 19 were hanged, and 1 was pressed to death.
Pressed.
We'll get to him.
She got the wine treatment.
yeah, it was really juicy.
Which wine?
Very juicy. Very low. And then 7-ish died in jail because jail was BAD.
I already thought it was like 6, so we're already witchier than I thought it was.
Way witchier than you thought. Yeah, 20 people were executed. By 1697, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was apologizing for how fucked that whole business in Salem was. Like, people at the time were like, this is batshit crazy. And we're quickly trying to, like, put a stop to it. And you know how batshit crazy something has to be for the official government to apologize for it in 4 years?
Yeah.
Ugh. Now, some of the who's of the Salem Witch Trials, there were, give or take, 70 accusers. That includes people who were like pointing fingers and people who were just eyewitnesses to the account, okay? And they included old, young, men and women, but they were largely, the accusers were young women in their teens and early 20s. I told you there were 200 people accused. Those included old, young, man, woman, but were predominantly older women were the victims. And there were 9 judges and hundreds of observers, okay? So these are the people, of all the things, though, that all these people were, they were all of them Puritans. Puritans, these poor fucks. I mean, they left England because of persecution, because they weren't allowed to freely practice this batshit religion.
They
which
weren't
is
allowed to
fine.
freely practice the most restrictive religion.
Yeah, and it's really wild because, like, on the one hand, of course, any Protestant religion is sort of rebellious by nature. It has already sort of rejected the structure and the boundaries and the tenets of Catholicism. Their ministers, for example, married, remarried, and had lots of kids, but in other ways, they just fully restrict. I mean, your religion has to be pretty gnarly for the Catholic Church to be like, y'all pump the brakes and let people live a little. You know, I mean, it was a mess. One of the things that makes it really interesting that everybody, the accusers, the victims, those executed, the judges, because they were all Puritans from the same town, is one of the many, many things that makes the Salem Witch Trials so fascinating, because it's not white versus black, rich versus poor, nationalist versus new immigrants. It's this real incestuous persecution. Highly respected ministers were executed. Upstanding mothers and grandmothers who were high-ranking in the church were executed. And bums and toothless bums and people that were found undesirable. But it was just this, among the things we ask when we look back on this, is like, what the fuck is that? It makes us super, super fascinated. So here's my plan.
Okay.
Alex Malt. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to tell you the basic story of the Salem Witch Trials that year, 1692 to 1693, crazy year of the Salem Witch Trials, all the HILFY little details. Then we're going to take a break.
Okay.
When we come back in the second half, we're going to go through the 330 years since then for the answers to why. Why the hell did this happen and how did this happen? You mentioned when we just first started talking, you were like, the ergot is a theory. And every once in a while, people come around sniffing around Boston, probably talking about, I've cracked the code. I know why the Salem Witch Trials happened, because it feels so unbelievable that just otherwise decent human beings that look like us and speak our language and are part of our founding ancestors could just lose their minds spontaneously and so dangerously and so suddenly. And then it just fizzles away. It just ends. It's just, so we're going to get into that in the second half. Are you ready to fuck the Salem Witch Trials?
I'm so ready to fuck the Salem Witch Trials. Especially now that I learned I can say that since it's the women's fault, right?
These fucking bitches. I know know, it's kind of tough as a white, straight guy these days to be like, fuck those bitches. But yes, you have full permission from a good feminist. Fuck these bitches.
I want to be clear. The witches are the victims.
See, you already screwed it up. See what happens when you try? It just always falls apart. All right, let's fuck. So it is 1692 January.
All right.
Salem, it's cold. It's fucking cold. Do you remember the winters up there in Boston?
I sure do.
How cold were they, girl?
They were so cold. They were cold as a witch's tit, right?
Ow.
Is this where it comes from? Did we learn the origin story of cold as a witch's tit?
I don't know. I do have some stories about tits later, but that one is unsolved. But 1692 Salem, January, cold house. This particular house is owned by the Reverend Samuel Parris. His house is particularly cold, okay? And it isn't just because it's Salem and it's January. It's because he doesn't have enough firewood. And it's bitter. He's bitter about it. Because the reason he doesn't have enough firewood is because his fucking congregation is not paying him enough. Yeah. Now, they're all broke and whatever, but they sort of lured him there, and he really kind of thought as the minister of this new town that he would have more, and they had negotiated a certain salary, and it was like the firewood was part of it, and they kept saying, we'll give you money for firewood, but he doesn't want money for firewood, he wants the firewood itself, and it's causing conflict. And it's cold, and he's sitting in his cold-ass house, and he's just mad. In his house with him is his almost always bedridden wife. And when she's out of bed, she's just completely subservient, perfect Puritan wife, but she's mostly in bed. His daughter, Betty, who's 9, and his niece, Abigail Williams, who lives with them now because her whole family was slaughtered by Indians out there on the frontier. And she is now an orphan servant maid that like helps out with bedridden mom and lives in the house.
So it's a super happy household.
This place is thumping. Oh, yeah. Okay. So Betty and Abigail are good friends. Sleep in the same bed, hang out all day. I'm sure, by all accounts, they're buddies, right? And one day they decide to try their hand at fortune telling to see if they can figure out who their husband's going to be. Take it from me. Every teenage girl is preoccupied to some extent with her future love life, her present and future love life, right? We know that. You can, whatever it means. We've sold lots of romantic comedies and board games and books based on
I
like.
Just picture that thing the like 4-sided thing that you do in your hands and you chant at and like. Yes. Open a little leaf and it will tell you.
Yes, you have chosen one of my favorites from the hundreds of examples of, how young girls try to divine who's he going to be, what's he going to look like, okay?
Witches.
Total witches. But let's try to appreciate for girls in Salem in 1692, who your husband is going to be is more than just like a heartthrob question. This is everything. Because your life is gonna suck no matter what. The cold is not stopping. The babies that if you're lucky enough to survive childbirth, and if your kids are lucky enough to survive their own childbirth, your days are still spent churning butter and weaving, and while the men disappear first thing in the morning to go hunt and do their own thing, and it's going to be a slog. Hopefully, the person that you sleep with every night doesn't want to beat the shit out of you. And that would be great, right? So your whole existence, whether you're going to have any monicum of pleasure in your life at all, depends on this question. And it's a known field. Yeah. The men that you may or may not marry are really apparent. This is not like some handsome strangers coming into town. And for people like Abigail, her prospects are virtually none. Because she's an orphan servant who has no dowry. So this is all sort of, right? Everything sucks. We don't know if this came from the enslaved woman who lived in the house. Her name is Tituba. Or if it was some sort of old English superstition. But those two girls crack a raw egg into a glass of water. And what they see in the shape of the yolk is supposed to give them some information about who their future love will be. And it looks to them like the yolk turns into a coffin.
Ooh.
Which spooks them.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, over the next 48 hours, these two girls go crazy. And by crazy, Alex, I mean babbling, bouncing around, contorting their bodies into wild positions. Their joints are jerking. Abigail reaches into the fire and throws embers around the room. They're losing their damn minds. For a moment...
She really doesn't want to marry that undertaker, huh?
I guess. For the moment, this seems to escape the attention of Reverend Samuel Parris, the man of the house, but not forever.
Burning embers are easy to miss,
Eventually, you can only ignore a radically insane teenage girl for so long. Take it from me. So he eventually is like, oh my God, right? This is nuts. And starts the line of questioning, which seems very apparent at first, that anyone would see with somebody behaving like this. And what's happening? What's going on? But then he eventually starts to ask, who is doing this to you? Which is a question the girls answer. And the first thing they say is Tituba. Okay. She's, as I said, not only the enslaved woman in the house, but I think she's one of the only people of color in the entire town. This isn't a time of enslavement. First of all, there aren't a lot of enslaved people there yet. We haven't really ramped up that element of our atrocities quite yet.
We're still on the whole burning witches thing. Hanging witches.
Exactly. And there are a lot of enslaved. There was a lot of white indentured servitude going on in the colonies. We found that the Native Americans were not very great slaves because they just go home. And also these people economically couldn't have afforded anything anyway. All of that to be said, she was an island already. So Tituba is brought in for questioning by the Reverend, and she says, well, I'm not a witch, but I did bake them a witch cake. Exactly. My friend Alex goes, oh, probably the same thing.
A witch cake. I have that recipe. That's a Betty Crocker recipe, right?
It is. And if you recall from your Betty Crocker recipe, a witch cake has the urine of the afflicted girls baked into the cake. Then the cake is fed to a hog, and then you watch the hog for some more divination. Or the hog's digestive system is supposed to like purify them. Hard to say.
It's also the recipe for matzah, by the way.
Very well known. Very well known. So Reverend Samuel Parris hears this from Tituba and is like, wow. And he's watching the behavior of these two girls, clearly possessed by the devil, clearly overtaken by something. His West Indian slave has now admitted she's brought witchcraft into this whole thing. Tituba had to know she was in trouble. And by all accounts, anything she said was beaten out of her relentlessly. She, however, delivers marvelously what the people want to hear from her. She continuously, strenuously denies being a witch herself, but articulates in vivid, captivating detail how the devil appeared to her and demanded that she serve him. How that he appeared as a dog, that she'd be walking around, he would appear as a dog, then magically transform into a man, demand that she serve him, get so angry when she wouldn't, and then would turn into a bird and fly away. Sometimes he had a yellow bird with him. Sometimes he had a red cat. Sometimes he had a black cat. How he would come out of the shadows. I mean, this is fucking compelling stuff. Yeah. She eventually says that she saw a book. He kept trying to get her to sign her name in his book and pledge her loyalty to him. And that every time he'd show her the book, she could see other names written into it. Okay. Exactly. Alex, there is no more red meat for a Puritan village than what I just described. Okay?
It hooks me. I'm hooked, and I have a TV.
I have a TV, and I already know this story. You know what I mean? It's fascinating. And the Puritan people believe deeply in these things. They preach endlessly about a very personified God and a very personified devil locked in an eternal spiritual warfare. Still a very common dialogue among many different tenets of Christianity is this concept of a fight for good and evil, not just for the world. And even not just for every human soul, but for everything. Like there are demons and angels fighting over whether or not you have another cup of coffee. And there are demons and angels fighting over whether or not you read that magazine. I mean, it is this sort of constant battle. And you as an individual are either praying and helping the good guys or actively serving and helping the evil ones. It's pretty stark. And the end is nigh. The end times and the apocalypse, always this fetish of our Christian cults. And this is yet more demonstration that the end is nigh because, as you know, the devil comes back in force and the dead rise and ghosts and apparitions come in force. And it feels like it could be the end of the world because everything sucks. And so all of a sudden word gets out that these two girls are going crazy, that Tituba made a witch cake and the devil is in the shape of a dog. And it's a wildfire in Salem. dozens of more girls are suddenly afflicted in the same way. They're shrieking in church. They're pointing at apparitions that they see. It's completely crazy. And no one knows what the fuck is going on. I mean, because there's no way to deny it.
Yeah.
There's no way to deny it without denying that God exists or that spiritual warfare is real. But there is something like a structure for this. We have had witch trials before. There is something like a precedent in the law, right? And so they get the court of oyer and terminer, which is an old English style court. It means to hear and determine. Okay. Oyer.
Okay.
And terminer, which is some Anglo-Franco, Latin diffused term that just means a group of respected individuals who have been, brought together to hear and determine the outcome of a grievance or some sort of court case. Okay.
Yeah.
So they get 9 justices together to figure out and to try and to sort out judiciously this witchcraft situation. These individuals own everything in town.
Yeah.
They are already the richest, own the most land, are the deepest connected, and they all are fucking each other and intermarried, and they own each other's, you know what I mean? They already sort of elected each
They all
other.
have 6 fingers in each hand.
Very much, very much. And you need 5 of these guys to be a quorum so they could sort of take, really move through and take their time off as they need to. We don't know exactly what justices were present at what court hearings because, Alex Malt, all of the official court records were destroyed, are gone.
By witches?
Completely vanished. If only. I think the witches probably would have liked to have kept them around, actually. But as I've alluded to from the beginning, this whole thing is a shame.
Yeah.
It is a shameful, shameful thing that virtually everyone involved regrets at various levels really fast.
It's the January 6th of
like
we
this
done
has
fucked
been
up.
like all bad ideas, super popular for a year. So we don't have the court records from the oyer and terminer, but what we do have are the eyewitnesses, people who were there and wrote a travel journal or a diary or a letter to somebody, and that still gives us a lot of crazy
I like the
stuff.
idea of a travel writer then.
Yes.
Back then. It's like, I traveled 3 months and now I'm 40 miles outside of the city. Let me tell you, the trees here, they're slightly different.
Yeah. Okay, so these court trials, like I said, we don't have the official, whatever the official transcripts even would have been. Who knows how helpful they would have been. But what we do have is crazy, is part of the reason why 330 years later, you and I are still sitting down with our hands on our foreheads and our eyes wide looking at each other like, what the fuck? So one of the things that made the Salem Witch Trials so fascinating was that they allowed for things like spectral evidence. Okay? Spectral evidence is essentially taking as evidence someone's claim that they saw a witch, a spirit. So you'd be sitting in the courtroom and Abigail Williams suddenly shoots her eyes up at the ceiling, points and starts shrieking, "It's Goody Osborne! It's Goody Osborne! She's coming!" And then just starts jerking around, "She's pinching me!" And crying and why are you okay? Normally you and me would see this and we'd be like, "Abigail, stop it." Like you if I was psycho, right? But what they did in the court of oyer and terminer was look at Goody Osborne and be like, "Bitch, why? Why are you tormenting this poor girl? Stop it." And Goody Osborne's like, "What the fuck?" And she's like, you can hear her, right? She's obviously getting pinched. Look at her.
Yeah.
And you just, Goody, like, what? And that was it. That was considered.
Getting arrested for that game of I'm not touching you, I'm not touching
That's exactly it. Getting arrested for that is exactly right. And so you've got people, like I said, these dozens of girls, and it starts off just being teenage girls, just pointing, twisting, accusing from their home, jumping up in the middle of church and screaming at the minister.
We've all wanted to do that, let's be fair.
God, but this is like, they have this
Not
permission
Puritan.
slip all of a sudden. And, Reverend Samuel Parris, who doesn't go near his daughter ever, is now at her bedside, holding her hand and asking who else and what did they do, and the gasps and the care. I mean, It matters.
Munchausen's.
Yes, exactly right. So the spectral evidence is one of the things that is brought in, but of course you cannot execute someone solely on spectral evidence.
Just mostly, right?
But you need a witness. Something like, oh yeah, when, Goody Osborne walked past my chicken, and then that chicken died 6 weeks later. So I'm a witness to say, yes, she's a witch. People would bring up their own urinary tract infections. I haven't been able to urinate right since Goody Osborne, brought some flowers over. Or if you had any kind of conflict with someone.
Yeah.
There was something like, we squabbled over the cost of something or the trade. And then I went home and, my eggs were all foul. That seems pretty obvious. That was taken as direct evidence that the court would hear and be like, yes, that sounds about right to us. One of the craziest parts to me is this thing called the touch test. And the touch test was if you, Alex, are an afflicted girl, just writhing and, Dawn Brody is pinching me and she's hurting me. One of the things that they could take into evidence was if I went over and touched you, the symptoms would miraculously stop. Because as we all know, of course, that somehow breaks a bond or the spell or like the conduit through which, there really isn't.
It makes you realize you're being an idiot because other people are around.
But it has to be the person who's afflicting you. So the symptoms would only stop if the witch who's afflicting you touched you. So what the court could always do if they just weren't sure from the spectral evidence and the eyewitnesses if the individual was a witch is they would have them walk over and touch the afflicted girl, and if the symptoms suddenly stopped, then that was a sure sign, done deal. You're dead in 2 days. Crazy. The executions took place in Salem. As I said, 19 of the 20 were hanged. The one who was pressed to death was an old man named Giles Corey. And the reason he was pressed and not hanged was because by the time he was brought to the court, he realized that the way that things had gone, if you confessed, and certainly if you incriminated someone else, you would not be executed. 99.9% of the time, you'd have your property confiscated. You would lose a lot of your wealth, and you may spend some time in jail, and then you get a fee for the time that you spent in jail, but you would get away with your life. The other people in your household might also be tried because now you are an admitted witch, so they must also be. So it can be real hairy, but maybe you'll survive. If you don't confess and they find you guilty, you're executed. So he finds himself in court, now is accused, and he owns a lot of land, a lot. Yeah. He's a kind of a rich guy. And he knows that no matter what he says, he's going to lose it all, and he's 80. So when the court of Oyer and Terminer asks him, how would you like to be tried? He doesn't answer. And they can't technically try him because they're making up the rules as they go, but that was kind of one of the rules. They can't hang him for being guilty if he didn't whatever. So they go back to the old school and they decide to press him. And what this means is they dug a hole, he laid on his back, and they put boards over his body. And then they would slowly stack heavy stones on top of these boards. It took 3 days. At some point, his tongue popped out of his mouth. And they pushed it back in with the tip of a cane.
So his head is exposed and the boards are like on the
laid
chest
on his
down.
chest. And they just kind of continually add the pressure. This is, even for them, an archaic, primitive form of torture. And it takes him several days to die. And when he does finally die, they just throw some dirt on him and leave. And the legend says that his family came and retrieved his body, but they never confiscated his property.
Nice.
Giles Corey.
That is way less funny than the wine press that I was picturing for when he got pressed.
Yes.
Quality Massachusetts witch wine.
Now, some of this, you got to be asking, like, what the fuck? Spectral evidence and the touch test and, like, where are they getting this stuff?
Basically,
of the sources...
it's like, this all seems like things that your daughter would have invented. I could imagine Beatrice coming up with each and every one of these rules.
Alex, you completely
if a
read
witch
my mind.
touches you, then you're fine. Then she's definitely a witch.
You're completely right. It feels so childlike, so infantile, even though the stakes are so high. I never get through a reading of the Salem Witch Trials without thinking about Lord of the Flies.
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit more about why they did feel a bit like they were adrift because of like the world circumstances and the way that the world power was shifting around them. Where were they getting all of these ideas of like how you would even try a witch? Some of them they had adopted from England and the English witch trials, but some of them came from this book written by a guy named Cotton Mather.
I've heard it.
He's like one of the few names that like people are like, yeah, I know that guy Cotton Mather. He was very tied up in this, and he wasn't one of these 9 judges. He wasn't a witch accuser or anything. But he had sort of inadvertently provided the source material for them because in 1688, in the city of Boston, there had been an accusation of witchcraft. 2 young girls were suddenly afflicted, similar kind of babbling and physically contorting. And Cotton Mather took these 2 girls into his home, evaluated them and spoke with them, and determined that it was the Irish Catholic housemaid. Mm-hmm. She confessed under undoubtedly strenuously torturous conditions and is executed. And he wrote a book about it. This book served as an obvious sort of inspiration for what happened in Salem. So Cotton Mather is now in a bind where he sees that this stuff has gone completely off the rails, and these lunatics in Salem are just like slaughtering each other, kind of using his book as an example. And he doesn't know.
There's an uptick in how to kill a witch in 10 days.
Yeah,
it's like,
exactly.
What's with this sudden uptick in sales for my normally obscure book?
Yeah, and he's kind of like stuck because he can't say that book, stop it, that book's bullshit, or what you're doing, because it would be delegitimizing himself,
self-incriminating.
He does eventually go down and witness some of the executions, but he's around, but he doesn't know quite how to stop it. He does ultimately become somewhat influential in helping bring it to an end, but just not as fast as he maybe could have. Here's the worst judge. So these 9 guys, you can imagine, bunch of cunts, right?
Yeah.
Here's the worst one, in my opinion, is a guy named John Hawthorne. He was so inclined to not believe the victims and so ready to be like, why are you pinching these poor girls? That everyone agreed that the afflicted girls really turned it up when he was around.
Yeah.
He, horrible manipulative tactics, like bringing in the young children of the victims and tricking them into incriminating their parents and using the kids to get the parents to confess more quickly.
People, huh?
Awful. He definitely personally enriched himself on the confiscated goods from the victims and didn't even make any qualms about it. Like, he was confronted by someone who was like, you took all of our horses and now you're riding them. Like, how dare you? And he very smugly said, would you have us starve while we settle your town's business?
Mm-hmm. Can you imagine if it just like judges in Miami these days just like driving around in 8 Ferraris that they confiscated from drug dealers?
I know, but they say that's kind of what the cops do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, if you find this concept abominable, you need to look around because it's not that unheard of. But we don't, obviously. We all agree it's horribly unfair. Mm-hmm. However much it happens, it is still horribly unfair. And he's also considered sort of a hypocrite, and people are very suspicious of John Hawthorne because he was very devout. He's a Puritan, as they all are, and he believes in God and the devil and the stakes and heaven and hell and the real structure of this stuff. And yet he seemed awfully unafraid of being in the presence of these possessed, demon-influenced individuals. He didn't seem to have sort of an accompanying anxiety.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Historians have not treated him well. In fact, his own family didn't. His descendant is Nathanial Hawthorne, who's the author of The Scarlet Letter. Which is one of my favorite books, and details some sort of incredulous behavior from colonial people. But he made a very public statement knowing that his ancestor was a judge in the Salem Witch Trials and was like, that piece of shit, and kind of apologized on behalf of the family. But as you've heard, as I've said from the beginning, the Salem Witch Trials were an awful abuse of power, a terrible, shameful way for any community to behave. And a lot of people knew it from the time it started all the way to the end and helped to hasten it to its end. But because of a number of circumstances, it was really hard to do. So basically, the Salem Witch Trials just fizzled out because Boston
Yeah.
Your people came in and were like, you know what? This is highly unusual, isn't it? To just execute.
Boston doesn't
20
get to be
people.
the good guy
So
that
we're
often
gonna-
in
no,
stories.
isn't it
Let me
great?
tell you, this is a good one. Usually we're doing something bad, but
No,
time-
and they slid into like a really good stepdad where they didn't make too much fuss. They were like, we'll just take this off. Your jail's full. We'll just take this. And so they took all of the witches that were accused and currently sitting in prison, and they took the caseload from Oyer and Terminer. And they were like, we'll do this in the full light of day in a big city.
yeah.
And they went through the trials. I think they may have convicted another 2 or 3 people, but they were not executed. They were appropriately punished and their stuff was taken. And I'm sure nobody had a good time, but the execution stopped. And once they got through the end of the court filing, they were like, okay, we're done now. Anyone who accused anyone from then on was scrutinized in a slightly different way. And then everyone lifted their heads in 1694 and it was all over, which is why by 1697, the families and people were like, hang on a goddamn minute. Does anyone remember when they just swept through and picked us up and took us to court and a lot of us died? Like, come on. And
Remember when they killed my mom?
Can we take a hot minute and just address that? And of course, here we are.
Yeah.
All these years later, where there's been some official apologies, even as late as like the 1990s. The city of Salem was like, we just really want to reiterate how really bad we feel about all of that. And it was horribly unfair. So, we're going to come back in part 2 and talk about the theories about why all of this happened. But before we go to our break, Alex Malt, do you have any questions?
What's the population of Salem at this time?
It was growing, but it was small. I want to say that the population, if you included Andover,
Okay.
which is a town sort of northwest of Boston, which had some of the accusers and some of the victors came from there, it was like 800, give or
Okay.
take.
Wow.
I think it was
so
always
that's like a percentage of the population that they took out then.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a lot. It's a
That
lot
is
of
a
people
lot.
to kill in 1 year. My friend Alex, we are going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to regale you with why. Are you ready?
I'm so ready.
I mean, it's nuts, right? It is. And stick around for part 2, because while some of the explanations that people have offered up over the years give some context for what happened in Salem, it makes it no less nuts. Now, before that, though, increase your stores of great educational podcasts with my friend Dead Air Dennis Maller. You'll hear from him next, and then we'll jump right back in with part 2 of the Salem Witch Trials.
Hi, I'm Dead Air Dennis Maller, host of another educational podcast devoted to helping you get smarter and laughing all at the same time. It's called Word of the Day with Comedians. It's the funniest way to expand your vocabulary and is available on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. Now it's time for the history you were never taught from the person who should never teach it. HILF, History I'd Like to Fuck with Don Brody.
Follow me, follow me, follow me, follow. Follow me, follow me, follow me, follow.
Witch, please. Part 2 of the Salem Witch Trials. Now, I did mention that there were witch trials before. We know our good friends in Salem did not invent the idea of witchcraft. Okay? So the witch trials before, though, in England, they were at their peak 1400 to
Yeah.
there was still some in the early 1700s. And in Scotland and in Ireland, they did have on their books the Witchcraft Acts, which put into their legal code how to identify a witch, how to try her, how to sentence her. It was largely her. What were the constraints of witchcraft? I mean, it was laid out in the law.
When did
But-
witches go from good to bad? Because wasn't there Merlin? Merlin was based on a real person that was in a court, right?
Sure. Well, I think that you touch a very important point on this, which is what is construed as witchcraft has always changed, kind of as our evolution of technology has changed. So with figures like Merlin, who are sort of somewhat based in reality but mostly fictional, even up to figures like Rasputin or other sort of divinely inspired witchy style characters, could it be that they were just a little bit better than everyone else at utilizing a new form of technology and understanding and even psychology? For example, why we don't think Albert Einstein was a magician because we sort of understand that he had a tool for science. His brain was particularly good
Yeah, because
at
he
utilizing...
was an alien that the aliens gave us as a gift, right?
Okay, so see, there are some people who still aren't sure if maybe he was magical. But I think that, some people just had access to certain elements and the knowledge of how to combine them to make medicines.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
if you just simply knew how to identify a certain number of plants and then how to extract the element of that plant that changed the human body, that was considered witchcraft. Then later we're like, obviously that's not witchcraft, that is medicine. That is now those individuals who know how to do that, and we know they can learn how to do that.
Plants and
is
herbs
medicine.
and leeches.
That's
That's
it.
medicine.
That's it. You got to align the humors. You need more wet was a prescription for about 500 years. But if you knew a lady in the woods who could keep you alive when you were delivering a baby,
Yeah.
versus just sitting next to the cold stone, by the fire on a fur with your dad
Yeah.
and your uncle and your male sons around you, just yelling. You're like, no, I'll go to that old lady's hut in the woods because sounds like she knows how this works and she can do this. That would easily label this old lady a witch.
I think we've gotten a little too lax on witchcraft, if you ask me, because I think all these crystal-loving people out in L.A. would technically qualify as witches
That's
if they
right.
were in 1692.
100%. Just looking at one of them crystals, let alone wearing one. Yeah, you're right,
I'm not saying
Alex.
we should kill them, but we should at least
We should put them in a
publicly-
wagon and drive them around town, though.
at least once a year.
Here's one of the fascinating things about these witchcraft acts, though, that I didn't have enough time to, of course, to go. We're not in the English witch trials, we're in the Salem witch trials, but these legal guidelines in England about how to try a witch in the witchcraft acts changed at some point in the early 1700s to no longer discuss the punishment for you doing witchcraft. And changed to punishing you for claiming that you could do witchcraft. And I'm no lawyer, girl, but I find that kind of a monumental shift in a legal code, which is still called the Witchcraft Acts, changing some language, but essentially, suddenly denying that witchcraft is real.
Yeah.
That the foundation of this law and why they had it up until the early 1700s was not only because they believed very much in witchcraft, they believed it was so real, it was a threat to the government and to the people, a significant enough threat that they needed to put into the legal code a way to handle it and persecute it to the point of death. And then it's, if you say you're a witch, you can be tried for being a con artist. You know what I mean? You're not allowed
Yeah.
to sell a false bill of goods and say you're a witch if you're not. That's a big fucking deal, especially if your mom fucking died in jail as a witch and was pressed to death, and now you're like, wait. I just run
Now
around
the
town
opposite is-
telling everyone I'm a witch and I'm going to get in trouble for lying? Oh my God. Anyway, maybe we can dig into that later, but that was England's deal. All of that to say, England was looking over their Massachusetts Bay, though, being like, what?
Explain to me why we want to keep them again.
And 200 in the town have been accused of it. And don't forget, a bunch of them are confessing.
Yeah.
As I've told you, they're confessing to save their lives. But this just makes everybody even more like, wait a minute.
That's when you confess so hard, right? That's when you do the I am a witch and I will burn this entire place down if you don't free me.
You're 100. That's my fucking tactic. Exactly right. I'm like, urinary tract infection. Urinary tract infection. You all have it, right? Everybody. And you just look and you're like, you're a fat piece of shit who's probably got gout. How's your big toe?
Maybe that's why
I
New
did
Englanders are the only people that drink cranberries.
Maybe.
Witch hanging and urinary tract infections. Salem, Massachusetts, where lovers go.
We put the I in UTI. Alex Malt, I'm going to go through the theories now because, as I've said, this is a puzzle. The Salem Witch Trials are a real puzzle. We know that sometimes people go nuts. We know that there's cults. We've seen cults go crazy. We've seen cults commit mass suicide. We've seen people commit great acts of violence against people outside of their community. All sorts. But this is just such a unique little critter. Lots of books, lots of study. You can major in the witch trials, girl. So I have gone through and I have selected for us my favorite theories about why. The first one seems to sort of permeate all of this stuff, which is girls suck, especially teenage girls. That's just kind of the headline, is that crazy ass teenage girls are dangerous and they're loony. And we've got the Manson girls as another example. We've got, do you remember Slender Man?
I do. Those girls that brought the other girl into the woods and stabbed her?
Stabbed her. Did they kill her? I don't remember. They
No,
tried.
she
They tried
survived.
to kill her, but she crawled her bloody ass out of the woods. And
Yeah,
it was
a
like
hiker found her or
her
something.
two friends wanted to kill her for the sake of this Slender Man fella that was on the internet. I don't know. And I can attest to this, having been a teenage girl and in the company of teenage girls, and with the privilege of looking down the barrel of raising a teenage girl someday. They do suck a lot. And I think that one of the reasons why teenage girls can be a real pain in the ass, a real unique, special, sort of painful, scary creature, is the same reason that every human being can be a very scary creature, which is when they are sort of compartmentalized into something that doesn't fit and isn't accurate. And we all know we do this. You know, we're always kind of putting people into various things. But as a teenage girl, maybe it is especially difficult because, God, it's this combination of we're trying to keep you safe.
Yeah.
Because everybody wants to, what they're not saying, fuck you to death. Like you are just this little piece of bait walking around the world and everyone wants to hurt you. They either want to love you to death or they want to show you off or they want to put you down or they want to exploit you. You're just in so much danger. Let us protect you. I get it.
Yeah.
You just, at some point you want to, goddamn Brittany, shave my fucking head and do anything I can for you to see something other than a teenage girl first. Just human first. And it's so sexualized in the Crucible.
Yeah.
They really are like, what was up with these teenage girls? I know. They wanted to fuck everybody. They must have been lesbians and they were really felt guilty about being lesbians. They wanted to fuck the minister. And so they were trying to get his wife to get, the Crucible sort of sets up this love triangle thing. And here's the thing that I didn't know until I read these books. And I'm really glad I know now. A disproportionately high number of these girls, 9 of my count, witnessed horrible, brutal violence at the hands of Indians out there on the frontier. Now, I use the term Indians only because that is the term they are using, okay? And also talking about this stuff is so sticky in 2022 because from our perspective, of course, the Native American population of the North American continent have been systematically brutalized and victimized from personal to domestic to legislative. It's just this awful, shameful thing that started bad and just kept getting bad. Okay?
And culminated in teams naming themselves.
At least we did them the honor, though, of making stupid, awful caricatures on our football teams. But at this point, in 1692, it's still something of a fair fight. Okay? I said it was 200 years since Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And the native populations of the North American continent have kind of gotten wise.
Yeah.
Like we've moved on from Thanksgiving. And these white fucks are awful.
Yeah.
And we have already behaved in a way that demonstrated our intent to wipe them from the face of the earth and to bulldoze them and their rights and their property at every turn. And they were accurately assessing the threat of the white settler.
Yeah.
And the violence and the bloodshed was stark. The native populations were joining with France in a lot of circumstances to fight against English settlers specifically. And native populations were joining together, overcoming their own previous divisions in order to really make formidable forces against these white settling outposts. And Salem's kind of out there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's...
which is crazy, right? 40 miles outside of Boston is out there.
It's really out there. And they had tried, and many of the families in Salem had tried to creep out. They'd go out another few miles and they'd set up an area and they'd start to harvest grain and they'd build a homestead and it would get burned and everyone would be murdered and they'd have to rush back to Maine or Boston or these sort of safeguards. And let me give you some examples of what some of these afflicted girls had gone through. Abigail Williams, who I told you was one of the first. You saw the egg. The coffin in the egg. Her whole family was hatcheted to death in an event that she almost certainly witnessed, if not saw it, certainly heard it.
Yeah.
There's 2 girls named Mercy. ironically. Mercy Lewis had 2 different stints with her family, kind of out there in the frontier. In the first one, her uncles and extended family were murdered, and some of her siblings. She went to Salem to hide out for a while, then things calmed down. She went out again and saw her parents murdered by Indians, and that was at 15. That's 2 years before this. And now she's living as an orphan with her family, just like Abigail is. Mercy Short, get this. She is held hostage at the age of 15 after seeing her entire immediate family butchered to death. She's marched as a hostage to this kind of distant village. And on the way, they murder a 17-year-old girl, scalp her, decapitate her, and carry her head around to taunt the other girls as a way of like warning what will happen next. And she saw them hatchet a 5-year-old boy to death, according to her, for sport. She then watched 3 of the men from her town that she knew get burned alive at the stake.
That'll teach you to behave.
It is a rough hang, okay? Now, we know the effects that post-traumatic stress can have on your body, on your mind, hallucinations, sweating, anxiety, twisting. The likelihood that these teenage girls were having dramatic post-traumatic stress episodes, and it was being seen through the filter of a paranoid, hyper-religious, suspicious group that just kept asking, who? You know, but it does lead us into theory number 2, which is that this whole thing was all local politics. That these people, they were devout, they believed in God, but they were not actually sussing out witches. They were simply settling old scores and using this crazy hotbed situation to just like achieve their own ends.
It's a super easy way to get rid of your neighbor. Is just, hey, I heard she's a witch.
But bam. And the worst case is they're found innocent or they're found guilty, and then they just lose a bunch of shit, and you just get to kind of stick it to them.
Yeah. They might not be a witch, but they've got that witch tarnish on them for the rest of their life.
Tarnish is right. Now, of the accusers, one of the most prolific was a girl named Ann Putnam. She's 12. She's one of the things that feeds this theory that it was all local politics. Because
Putnam books? Ann Putnam?
Maybe. I don't know. I actually don't know if that's the line. But she's 12 at the time. She accused 19 people, 11 of whom hanged. If you remember our head count, that's over half of the executed victims.
She's playing baseball. She's in the Hall of Fame.
She is knocking witches out of this park. Bam, boom, bam.
It's like a 550 batting average right
exactly.
there. It's impressive.
It's really impressive. I mean, on the one hand, she's like this cunt who points a lot of fingers. On the other hand, she is a really good sniffer. But part of the reason why people point to Anne in support of this theory that this is all local politics is because Anne's dad was a real piece of shit. And he had grudges against everybody in town.
Yeah.
And he filed himself the vast majority of these complaints, way more than were brought to court, way more than were even convicted. Her dad was just throwing, Anne said it was, Anne said, you know.
I like picturing just an Ann Putnam billboard up, you know, like Ann Putnam, she'll get your witch convicted. Do you need a witch conviction?
That's right.
Call 1-800-Putnam.
Yeah, you find a dead chicken in your shed? Well, I know the witch that did it. Yeah,
call Anne.
Totally. But like poor Anne, I mean, I really think it's fair to say that she was this sad tool of her dad. She never married. Both of her parents died shortly after this, and she ended up raising all these fucking siblings of hers.
Cool.
And she was one of the only accusers to ever publicly apologize. And girl climbed up, you know, in front of the pulpit at her church as an adult. And it's, you can read it if you want to find her, and says, I am so sorry, I accused. But she doesn't say I was doing a bad thing. She says the devil, you know,
there's no putting this genie back in the bottle.
She wasn't like, I knew I was doing, you know, makes sense, right? Yeah, there was some local politics. There was some like some local gossip going down, 100% true. But it certainly doesn't explain all of this. It cannot sufficiently explain the subjugation and murder of your neighbors one at a time, you know, relentless pursuit. And it's not so local. We do not have America yet. It's 100 years until we get to the Constitution. We're still Little England. A lot of these people, when you read their letters, talk about both Englands. May there be peace in both Englands, because we are very much a subject to the king. And this is part of the reason why the ground is so shaky right now, because I don't know if you know about the English history of the Restoration, King Charles. So this crazy batshit English history is aligning perfectly with Salem, and it matters. It's sort of like if you wanted to talk about the Trump administration without mentioning COVID.
Okay.
Or you want to talk about what happened during COVID, but like, I don't want to get into the presidential politics. You're like, well, you're not really going to understand either one if you can't sort of explore the other. So I'll try to be brief. But in England, in the 1650s, huge shakeup. It was basically briefly a republic and not a monarchy. Oliver Cromwell killed King Charles I, dissolved Parliament, and made Britain a republic. He dies in office, which is, again, like crazy history. In 1658, Oliver Cromwell dies, and in 1660, his Charles I's son, the executed king, his son, is put back up on the throne, and it's the Restoration. We're back.
Crazy.
Oliver Cromwell, who briefly established a monarchy-less England, crazy, is also a Puritan. And the Puritans had fucked off from England because King Charles I was a dick and was really awful to Puritans. So all of these colonists, you know, who in Massachusetts, when they heard Oliver Cromwell fucking killed Charles I and we have a Puritan running Britain, we're like, fuck yes, fuck. They may or may not go back, but the bottom line is, like, we got our guy on the throne.
Utah if Mitt Romney wins.
Exactly. And they're getting there. Now, keep in mind, messages take a lot of time to get back and forth, but Oliver Cromwell is not there for very long. 1658, he dies, and now they realize not only is Charles II back on the throne, it's monarchy again, he's Catholic. Fuck. So they kind of
pissed. He's not only a Catholic, but he's pissed.
But even more than like how you feel about that and how that affects you legislatively, in between all of this crazy ground shaking, there's no longer a king in England, what the fuck, is who owns what land? Like, the governor in the Massachusetts Bay Colony is not going to have a firm grip on politics when he doesn't know who the king is and how you collect taxes and who owns what and what liens are what. What it means is that these fucks out in Salem for the last 30, 40 years, in addition to the Indian attacks, have been like, oh, sorry, new king, new laws, the governor's dissolved all land ownership and you have to buy it again.
Yeah.
You have to come to town. If you have first dibs on your land, but you need to come purchase it from the new government. There's been a lot of fuckery.
And then you need to purchase it and then fight off the Indians. It's a great place to raise a family here at the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
You're going to love it. Yeah. And the
price is so great, you'll lose your head.
Half off. Yeah.
Boom, boom, shh.
Yeah. Oh, wait, I got it. Hang on. See, I covered it. Ready? There we go. The uncertainty for the individuals living in Salem at this time were fundamental. From their faith now being shaken by these visions of the devil, getting their neighbors that they thought they knew are signing the devil's book in the middle of the night. They admitted it. They heard them admit it in church. And we don't know who's king or if there is a king. And we don't know who the governor is. There's also been all these turnovers of like who is running the actual colony itself. And the Native Americans are coming up in the middle of the night. And also I'm going to die from this weird gum disease. I mean, it's just a shit show. Everyone living in complete unorganized chaos.
Yeah.
It is a desperate attempt to make sense out of chaos. And if you have a grudge against someone, it just makes it easier for you to believe that they are doing it to you.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
This next theory, Alex, you actually predicted. You talked about this one a little bit because it's kind of a hot, among the witch trial jib-jab, it's kind of a hot topic. Ergot. Ergot is, for those of you who've never heard of it before, it is a hallucination-inducing mold that is found growing on some grains, some breads in certain kind of weather scenarios. We know it's happened before. We found it in the digestive systems of various people, and we know that it exists. And in 1976, this highly respected doctor, Linda R. Caporali, suggested that the Salem Witch Trials were not local politics, were not girls being bitches. It was a bona fide hallucination on behalf of the population who was eating this moldy bread and finding themselves tripping out.
Yeah.
Was that what you had heard?
Yeah, that's what I heard. Yeah.
Have you ever had ergot?
I've had ergot plus one other letter at the end because I think ergot's lysergic acid something else, but I've had lysergic acid diethamine or whatever LSD before, so I've had the better version of ergot.
Did you see any witches? Did you see any of your neighbors flying around when you did?
I did not, and I'm a little disappointed. I didn't see any. No people flying.
No. Some other things, sandwiches.
Floating sandwiches, breathing trees, portals to other dimensions, beautiful sunsets, things like that.
See, and I remember hearing this theory too when I first studied this in college, and I liked it. I remember kind of holding on to it, probably because I myself had just entered the wonderful world of hallucinogens, and I was like, they're great. I know that much. And I completely understand how if you did not know you took it and found yourself in a situation like this, that you'd be like, oh yeah, somebody's up my skirt with some witchcraft because this isn't right. And it's intriguing. And it's also really nice from a modern perspective to believe it was something like that, because then it lets us off the hook with all that, like,
it's not just weird base human instinct.
Certainly my building wouldn't turn into this, you shut the power off for 3 days. I think we're hanging a witch on the roof 100%. And we can sort of avoid that idea that we are susceptible in any way as victims or accusers, because we know better than to eat icky bread. And it was pretty roundly dismissed, as intriguing as it is. Botanists and other historians have argued that it would have affected the population more broadly. It was a really cold, wet winter, but is that when the grain was stored or when the bread was stored? Anyways, you can talk about it and tell people it's a theory, but that you have to finish by saying, people don't really believe it. Which brings us to my fourth and final theory, Alex Malt's theory is that it was the devil. For the faithful out there, and I, with respect, do not count myself among the faithful, but I do know and love those who are. And for Christians and Jews and Muslims and practicers of witchcraft and branch Davidians, what all of these religious share is a belief, a deep, fundamental belief in an invisible world. There are invisible forces and powers over which I have no control, that you cannot see, and that is just a basis. Which means that when you talk about the Salem Witch Trials, you can talk about how unjust it was, how shameful it was, how abominable it was. But one of the words they won't necessarily use is ridiculous. Because of the belief in the apocalypse, the belief in spiritual warfare and a biblical, inevitable apocalypse. And what Christians and Jews and Muslims all share is an Old Testament.
Yeah.
And the Old Testament, among other things, tells us this.
God will smote you, motherfuckers.
Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live.
Whew.
Ding. Leviticus says this.
It's right in between the parts about hating gays and stoning women.
Listen, every once in a while, this book really lays it out for you. Leviticus says, a man or woman who has a familiar spirit or that is a wizard shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones. Their blood shall be upon them. And Deuteronomy says, there shall not be found among you those who use magic. So, knowing the pure head count of the human beings on earth presently who consider themselves among the faithful, this is what many of their shared holy books says about this subject.
I get why super religious moms hate Harry Potter.
Sure. Yes, exactly right.
I want to see Harry Potter 8 or whatever the next one is. Like the Deuteronomy version where Harry Potter gets stoned.
Yeah, listen. And if you want to know why the witch trials fizzled out, and there was an apology, but in every apology, in every backing off, is the acknowledgement that witches are real, that witchcraft is a threat, that the devil is striving to take over every human soul and certainly bring down the church. And that what we all really need to apologize for, and what they did apologize for, was letting the devil deceive them into killing the innocent. Yeah. So they admit they killed the innocent, and they admit that they did it in this shameful way because the devil is wily. And one of the arguments that they really had to ham-hand into this conversation to get it to fly was, we can't take spectral evidence anymore.
Yeah.
Because the devil can take the figure of an innocent person. And once they used the Bible and they used the Puritan faith to undermine these arguments, that was the only foothold they had into bringing it down. And it was the Puritans and the other faithful who did stop the Salem Witch Trials.
It's kind of a metaphorical devil. I don't know how many years ago it was now, but in Denmark, there was this case where kids got sick from Coca-Cola being served in the lunchroom, and then it kind of started happening all over the country of Denmark. And I think they found that there was a slightly elevated level of something that gave the Coke a slightly weird smell, but was nowhere close to enough to make anybody sick. But because people heard the story of kids getting sick, kids made themselves sick. And I bet it's right around the same age as this. So, it could be, like, the seed was planted with the coffin thing, spread through the teenage population, because teenagers, like young kids specifically, are more susceptible to that. So, oh shit, she saw a witch. That explains this weird tingling in my pants. That's a witch.
So that, my friend Alex Malt, is the HILF of the Salem Witch Trials. Any
totally
questions?
hilfed the Salem Witch Trials.
I did. I stoned him. I pressed him.
You stoned me.
I hanged him. I
and
fucked
you
him.
Hilfed it.
What are you going to say the next time that you go home to Boston and somebody's like, who wants to go up to the Salem Village? What are you going to do? Are you going to go? Or are you not?
I'm going to drag them up there, and we're going to listen to the podcast on. I was going to say I'm going to sit them down and just give them a very dry version and torture them, but I think maybe we'll just listen to the podcast on the ride up.
That's good. Then you can just scroll on your phone and drink coffee and be like, right? Instead of actually having to talk
it'll
to
be
them.
like what we should do is just put on headphones when we get there and do like the audiobook tour of Salem,
that's
like
a
at
great
museum.
idea. What are your parents' names?
Brad and Sharon.
Hey, Brad. Hey, Sharon. This is Dawn Brody. I have your son here, and if you don't send me $500, I will burn him at the stake.
What? You're going to have to press me.
Oh, girl, I've heard that one before. Oh, Alex, thank you so much for assigning me this bitchin' subject.
Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you
this
for
is a lot
coming
of fun.
over. Let's do it again sometime.
Let's please do it again anytime.
Which, please.
Which, please.
Well, Alex, Brad, and Sharon, and everyone else who has tuned into this episode, thank you so much. If we can walk away with any consistent lesson from Salem, let it be this. The questions you ask are as important as the answers you get. In 2 weeks, come back for our Sweet 16 episode, Great Mistakes. It's a very special HILF where I sit down with comedian and longtime Conan writer Brian Kiley. We're digging into some of history's biggest and most hilarious fuck-ups. You don't want to miss it. Before we go, here is a podcast I think you'll love. I certainly do. Check it out. And remember, history's a party, and everybody's coming.
Hi there, I'm Laurel.
And I'm Katie.
Two sisters who love talking about history, and we are the hosts of Hightailing Through History.
In each episode, we surprise each other with a story about the unknown or unusual bits of history that make the past a goldmine of fun.
A Chinese sex worker turned pirate queen who had the largest fleet in history.
How one of the world's greatest generals was defeated by an army of rabbits. And what real-life person inspired the Mortal Kombat character Scorpion.
History's amazing women, daring escapes, unbelievable rescues, and hey, Canada's maple syrup cartel.
In addition to hightailing through different people, places, and events in history, we are also telling our tales high. Laurel, our resident stoner, but I prefer boozing.
But you don't have to enjoy those things to enjoy our podcast. We've staged you a seat in our smoke circle. Come relax, have a laugh, and enjoy history's weird and wonderful moments as we hightail through history.
That's Hightailing Through History. You can find it on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.